Bisom hooker suckers kaigunon son de tokeon meme ea paranutsai kunas katadapsai akaion.
Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. You can find links to the poems on the podcast listing and on my website, helenwing.com. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com. Hello and welcome to today's podcast, Elixir podcast, where we ask people what their favourite poem is and why they like it. And today we are talking to Richard, who I believe is going to talk to us about part of Homer's Iliad. Is that right? Hello, Richard.
Hello, Helen. Yes, I'm going to read part of the Iliad, the founding text, if you like, of the Western literary canon, as it's always been seen. And the section I'm going to read is the bloodthirsty death speech of Achilles over the body of Hector, the prince of Troy, whom he has just fought in front of the walls of Troy after his own return from his big sulk, the big sulk that's the driving force of the plot of the Iliad. Achilles is the greatest warrior on the Greek side, and he has defeated Hector in single-handed combat, and his blood is up. And it's an astonishing portrait of men at war.
Strength all spent, spake Hector, he of the gleaming helm. I implore you by thy life and thy knees and thy parents, suffer me not to be devoured of dogs by the ships of the Achaeans. Nay, take you my store of bronze and gold, gifts that my father and royal mother shall give thee. But my body return to my home, that the Trojans and the wives of Trojans may give me in death my due meed of fire. But with an angry stare from beneath his brows spake Achilles, swift of foot. Implore me not, dog, speak not of knees or parents. My wrath and fury bid me carve thy flesh and myself eat it raw, because of what thou hast wrought, as surely as there lives no man that shall ward off the dogs from thy head. Should they bring hither and weigh out ransom tenfold, I 20-fold, and should promise yet more, nay, not though Priam, son of Dardanus, should bid thy weight in gold, not even so shall thy royal mother lay you on a bier and make lament of you, the son she bore. No, the dogs and the birds shall devour you utterly. In my work as a foreign correspondent, I've often had time to think of this. We think of childhood tales of honour amongst foes, of battles settled by a chivalrous code of conduct. These tales are still told, in fact, in the Middle East, where I've spent much of my career. People there still remember the rivalry between Saladin and King Richard the Lionheart, after whom I'm sort of named. The Arabs remember Richard the Lionheart more even than we do. People, when I get into taxis in the Middle East, say, and they ask my name, they say, Richard the Lionheart, Kalb al-Assad, which is the Arabic for Lionheart. And they remember the fact that the wars between Saladin and the Crusaders were conducted according to a code of honor by which captives were sometimes released, treated with respect. But it was only partial. Even then, Saladin personally beheaded the Crusaders who he had turned against. Throughout the Crusades themselves brutalized and massacred tens of thousands of Muslims and Jewish defenders of the great cities, including Jerusalem. And when they captured Jerusalem, they left not a single Muslim or Jew alive that they found within the city walls. Arabs often retaliated in kind. And in the modern day, I'm often reminded that the norm of brutality towards the defeated has not gone away. If you look at the Second World War, for example, when 100,000 German troops were surrounded and surrendered at Stalingrad, only 5,000 of those Germans ever made it home again. They were taken to the Gulag and many perished there.
On dolegranion prosefe correspondent Hector. Disom hupe sukes kaigunon son de tokeon me ea paranutsai kunas katadapsai akaion. Ala su men chalcon te alis cruson te dedexo dora ta toi doi susi pater kai potnia mater. Soma de ochad emon domenai palin. Offra puros me troes kai troon alachoi lelachosi xanonta. On dar upudro udon prosefe podas ochus Achilles. Me kuon gunon gunadzeo me de tokeon. Ai ga pos auton me menos kai thumos aner apotmenon crea edmenai oia eogas. Ozuk esthos says te gunas kefales apalalakoi ude ken dechekis te kai eso sinerit apoina. Tesos ensad agontes chopokos dontai te kai alla ude ken sauton cruso erustastai agogoi dadenedinis priamos. Ud hos se gepotnia mete entemene lekesi goesetai on teken ote ala kunes te kai oionoi katapanta dasontai.
In the Syrian civil war, I came across this face to face. We all became used to, of course, the monstrous behavior of ISIS, Islamic State, when they slaughtered thousands of their captives, particularly those whose religion they didn't approve of, like the Shia or the Alawites of Syria. But this started much earlier, with both sides carrying out what we would regard as atrocities. The regime's atrocities, of course, were famous. ISIS's atrocities were merely copies of the regime's atrocities that many of them had learned themselves while being tortured in the Assad regime's prisons. But even the good rebels, the ones that the West supported, they were pretty remorseless. They killed their captives if they felt it was justified. I spoke to young men. I spoke to a young man who was trained as a lawyer who told me how he was part of an execution squad that killed regime soldiers that they captured if they found evidence of their own brutality on their mobile phones. That would be a reason for them to kill their captives without trial or anything that we would call due process. And then, most strikingly of all, I came across a story. Well, I didn't come across it. It was across all our television screens and newspapers in 2013, and it was a turning point in the war. Really, it was a rebel soldier, rebel fighter, who'd been involved in a battle for a town called Kaseya, and he had filmed himself, or been filmed, standing over the corpse of a regime soldier who he'd killed. And he was boasting to the camera, and he stood over this corpse and he slashed the dead man's stomach and grabbed in and reached the man's liver and held it up to his mouth, and he pretended to eat it. And this image went around the world, was taken as a sign that this was a war in which there were no good guys and no bad guys. All the sides were equally monstrous. He was known as the rebel cannibal, the Free Syrian Army cannibal. And indeed, who can defend or justify mutilating the corpse of the dead soldier? But it spoke to an idea that this was a war of savagery, unlike the wars that we think we're involved in. We think that we now observe these rules of war against, in fact, our knowledge of what's actually happened in the Falklands War. A war hero, a British war hero, in his was killed, and in his backpack they found the ears of Argentinian soldiers that he'd severed. Yet he was still regarded as a war hero. He still won medals. And I just heard the words of this Syrian rebel who went by the sobriquet of Abu Saka, and on the camera he shouted at the camera as he held this liver of his fallen enemy. He said, "I swear to God, we will eat your hearts, you Alawite soldiers of Bashar the dog." And I was immediately reminded of the speech of Achilles. Just to read that again. What did he say? "Implore me not, dog. My wrath and fury bid me carve thy flesh and myself eat it raw because of what thou hast wrought. As surely as there lives no man that shall ward off the dogs from thy head." It was almost as if Abu Saka was translating Homer, which of course I doubt he was, but he was somehow reaching into a past, constant narrative of 3,000, 4,000 years of Western history, finding in it the savagery that has conducted all wars.
When you saw this guy trying to eat the liver of someone he'd killed, and you were reminded of this poem, what do you think knowing that poem added to your experience of that emotionally? Did it help you cope better with that savagery? Were you stoical about it? Or how do you think the poem has affected your view of the warfare that you have witnessed?
I think at an emotional level, I've always wondered at how you can kill another person without remorse. And I think it is actually one of the great puzzles of warfare. And now, thanks to YouTube, in fact, thanks to the internet, we have a huge library of interviews with killers. And by killers, I mean soldiers, ordinary soldiers. And one of the emotional truths that is very hard to explain and understand is the sense that some people can kill without remorse and some can't. I think there was one estimate, somebody, I can't remember where this is from, it's from some study of soldiers in the Second World War, found that nearly all the killing in war is done by 1/10 of the soldiers. That many soldiers find ways of avoiding having to kill or are less ruthless, less programmed to kill, and that those fighters who are ruthless, who can kill without thinking, are responsible for most of the deaths, even in organised warfare. And there's a wonderful interview, I'm sure many people have seen it. It resurfaces on social media channels every Remembrance Day or thereabouts. It's an interview with a German soldier from the First World War. It was recorded decades ago. And he speaks very good English, which somehow for us adds the emotional effect, because of course we know that he was on the other side, and yet he speaks just like us. And he speaks very calmly of how his unit captured a French trench and how in the process they have to kill the French soldiers defending it, and how he heaves, having done this, he's killed with his bayonet another man for the first time, and he heaves and feels sick and is dizzy. And he describes how his two companions, who were men apparently completely like him in every other way, were gleeful at having killed the enemy. And he said he didn't understand how he was different from them. And the interesting thing about these studies is that there doesn't seem to be any link to criminal behaviour with these ruthless killers. They return to civilian life with no more likelihood of getting involved in criminality. Obviously, those who are psychopathic before, who are criminal before, may find it easier to kill, but those who are law-abiding citizens who find they can, once in uniform, can kill, can then go back to their day jobs and be good and decent citizens. So I've become, over the years, very wary of using terms like psychopaths and looking at individuals as if they are somehow beyond the bounds of normal human behavior. It's clear that, when it comes to ISIS, the organized brutality of that is horrific. The organized brutality of many wars is horrific and disgusting and repels me no less. But I think I'm more sympathetic to individuals caught up in this war, caught up in these wars, and aware of how none of us know how we would behave in the same circumstance. None of us can guarantee that in the right circumstances we too wouldn't be ruthless and merciless killers.
In this story, the story of Achilles and Practicus, you have the emotional reality that Achilles has just lost the love of his life and is clearly, or seems to be clearly, acting out of despair and grief as much as vengeance. I mean, ISIS may not be a good example, but in recent conflagrations such as the current Israeli-Gaza conflict, surely it's reasonable to think that most people will have lost someone they love. And this somehow frees people and disinhibits them from the more grotesque forms of killing. It's the performance nature of that killing that is so disturbing, right? You can understand why they would kill someone who's killed their mother, but the idea that they then perform a sort of theatrical disembowelment is much more disturbing.
Yes, it's very true that the theatricality of violence is what disturbs us. But I think what I would say, and again, it's a slow realization, but it is a realization which Homer, and which is why he's such a wonderful poet and why he's so relevant today and relevant to our human emotions and violence, that we think civilization has, removed from us, but clearly hasn't. If you look at any contemporary war, Homer recognizes the importance of theatricality in our lives. And theatricality isn't an optional extra added on to certain human existences. That, we all go about our daily lives and then occasionally someone becomes a drama queen or becomes, excessive. This theatricality, this performance for our peers, our colleagues, to make memories, to make history, to achieve to demonstrate, if you like, something beyond the daily humanity.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I absolutely get the feeling that some texts are truly universal in the sense that they pass through time and through cultures, and they resonate all over the world. And often I think we disregard some of the inspirations for art. We like to think that the muse is some airy-fairy person who's inspiring us with love, but actually hatred can also inspire great works of art, and especially rage, don't you think?
I think it's true, but the other thing I'm moved by is that love and hatred are so closely entwined in Homer, which is often not how he's seen. We often see the Iliad very generally as a sort of text of hate because it's about war, and the Odyssey, the other great Homeric work, which is about Odysseus returning to his wife Penelope, as one of love. But actually, the Iliad is the closeness of love and hate is very bound up with each other. The reason Achilles is so angry is that Hector has killed Patroclus, who was Achilles' closest companion.
It seems to be the nadir of humanity. Achilles can say these things to a dying man, but of course it gets worse because after Hector does die, Achilles mutilates his corpse and strings him by the feet to the back of his chariot and rides his chariot around the walls of Troy so that Priam, looking out from the walls, can see the disfigurement of his son's body. But then, of course, there's a resolution, and it's a theatrical resolution. It's an incredibly dramatic scene where Priam comes out of the city, this aged king who's seen his younger son destroy his city-state in pursuit of this crazed kidnapper of Helen. And he walks through the Greek lines, obviously at great personal risk, and also personal humiliation, because he kneels at Achilles' feet and begs Achilles for his son's body back. And if you remember, Achilles has said that will never happen. He's going to leave him for the dogs. But this theatrical exercise by Priam has its effect, and it has exactly the expected and intended effect. Achilles who's, as you say, acting under grief, and he recognizes the performance of grief by Priam. He, remembers the performance of his own relationship with his own father and the grief and suffering that the relationship between father and son involves in a warlike society. And he relents and allows Priam to take back Hector's body and calls for a truce for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, the funeral, it takes place of Hector. A pyre is built. Hector's corpse is burnt on the pyre. And this is how Homer describes it. And these are the last lines of the Iliad. This is how the poem ends. Rose-fingered dawn appeared, and then gathered the folk about the pyre of glorious Hector. When they were assembled and come together, first they quenched with flaming wine all the pyre, so far as the fire's might had come upon it. Then his brothers and his comrades gathered the white bones, in mourning, the tears flowing ever down their cheeks. The bones they took and placed in a golden urn, covering them over with soft purple robes, and they laid the urn in a hollow grave and covered it over with large, close-set stones. Then heaped they the mound, and round about were watchmen set on every side, lest the well-grieved Achaeans should set upon them before the allotted time. And when they had piled the barrow, they returned, and gathering together, feasted a glorious feast in the palace of Priam, the king, the foster son of Zeus. And thus was buried Hector, tamer of horses.
Thank you, Richard. That was lovely. Could you now, though, talk a little bit about the fact, what you were talking about before, about wrath being the first word in Western literature? I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, sure. As I say, we talk about Homer as being the start of the Western canon, the earliest piece of literature in the Western canon. And in light of this passage particularly, I was reminded that the first word of the Iliad is thumon, is this word which appears in that passage as well, which is wrath. The one translation of the first sentence is "Sing muse the wrath of Achilles." The motive is that Achilles has been offended by Agamemnon, who's like the king of the Greeks. The Greek army is made up of all these different warriors, the kings of their own city-states, and Agamemnon who's the brother of Menelaus, the spurned spouse of Helen, from whom Helen has been stolen, is the king of kings, and he's taken Achilles as concubine, a slave concubine for himself, and Achilles is furious and refuses to have any more part in the war and retreats to his tent, and that's the driving force of the narrative. So it's the whole Western canon of literature starts with a word for an emotion, and
it's a very male emotion, isn't it? Or in your view, it's a very male emotion.
Well, I don't think it's a male emotion. What I'm interested in is over the years, particularly recently, there's been an attempt to sort of divide up the psyche into male psyches and female psyches, and men are supposed to be rational or seen as somehow suppressing their emotions. That historically, toxic masculinity has been about not recognizing our emotions and giving vent to them. And this is the supreme work of toxic masculinity, to use a modern phrase, the Iliad. But the author, who is also male, presumably, we presume, is very aware of the emotions that underlie it, this interplay between love and hate and fear, and that's what this work is all about. And it's said of Plato, the Greek philosopher, much later than Homer, but it's said of him often that the history of Western philosophy is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato, because all the philosophical themes that Plato introduced and discussed are really the themes that all Western philosophers have discussed again. And in that sense, I do think sometimes that the Iliad and the Odyssey can be described similarly, that the history of Western literature is a series of footnotes to Homer, in that although we think of them as very alien, when you read them closely, you realise that Homer has set out all the plots and narratives and emotions that drive Western literature from there on.
Yeah, I can see what you mean, Rich. And I wonder also whether, if Homer were alive today, whether he would be a war reporter for the Times newspaper that you are. Just, documenting this, human wrath, anger, actually documenting anger, which is largely what you have to do, anger and trauma and misery and loss, really.
I think that's possibly true, that there's a lot of commonality there. Of course, Homer himself was famously, or at least by legend, blind, so I'm not quite sure how he would have got on in a battle zone. He has, taken in, the works of other poets and other stories that he has heard. And of course, this may be a legend, of course, we don't know who Homer was really, but if he was blind, you can see that he is someone who is like a sort of a sponge who has taken in all these ideas, all the stories he's been told from childhood, and then spun them out again in this extraordinary feast of words. But yes, there is something very journalistic about the whole plot, particularly of the Iliad.
Yeah. Well, Richard, thank you very much for giving us your thoughts on that gruesome section of the Iliad and helping us to realise that the feelings in ancient literature are still the feelings in the contemporary world. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. It helps us tremendously to reach more and more listeners who could also be touched by our guests' poems. That's hit follow, leave a review, and not 4, but a 5-star rating. This would give us just a little help that will make a great deal of difference. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. Thanks for listening.